Joining us now is Murtaza Hussain, reporter for Dropsite News, wonderful reporter, in fact, and someone who has some fascinating analysis that we're not getting anywhere else in regard to Iran's strategy in this ongoing war that unfortunately the United States and the Trump administration reignited recently with the dissolving of the memorandum of understanding. So Murtaza, you had a conversation with Ryan Grimm that I was so fascinated by, because one of the questions I had been asking myself is, why isn't Iran striking Israel? Like, it was actually angering me a little bit. But apparently you feel, or your assessment is that it's a part of a strategy. And I kind of want you to walk us through what that strategy is.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that, Anna, and thanks for having me on for this conversation. So I was talking to Ryan about this on the Dropsite live stream, but everything that's happening right now in the war has pretty much been predicted for a very long time. And I'm not speaking from any private information per se. This is all public source information that Iranian officials and military officials have been talking about for many, many years, even decades. They laid out their strategy for what they would do in a war. And that's what's happening at the moment. So, the way you should think about the current situation is that the war started on February 28th with this joint attack by Israel and the United States against Iran. And that joint attack was kind of the nightmare, most extreme scenario for Iranian defense planners, having to fight two nuclear powers simultaneously. And their view was that if they could survive the initial blow of such an attack, which was a question mark, then they would incrementally start to gain the advantage in a war which dragged on and became effectively a war of attrition. So, I remember at the time there was some questions in the first 72 hours and so forth. It was a really tremendous blow that they were taking. It was a real shock and awe type situation. And it was constructed that way, but they did ultimately survive that initial strike. I remember around March 4th, March 5th, you start seeing their counter strategy come into effect. And the way the counter strategy works is it doesn't just target Israel and the United States, it targets a larger network of missile defenses and radars, which have been constructed all across the Middle East, which were effectively a buffer zone created between Iran and Israel by the Gulf states and Jordan, in cooperation with Israel and through the auspices of CENTCOM. They created a system called the NEAD, and that's the Middle East Air Defense. It's the name of the program. And basically, they would all cooperate to shoot down Iranian missiles and drones and potentially aircraft in the event of a war. In practice, what that really meant was that the Gulf Arab states created like a helmet or forest around Israel of defense, such that any missile or drone that was fired at Israel would have to run the gauntlet through all these countries, probably be shot down and so forth. So, it was not really, if you look at it on a map, it doesn't seem that beneficial for the Gulf Arab states near Iran, but it's tremendously good for Israel because it's the farthest country away from Iran before you get to the Mediterranean. So what the Iranians have been doing the last since the war started, but especially since the war started again with the collapse of the MOU, is they've been hitting the defenses which are part of this NEAD system, which are closer to Iran. So they've been destroying radars in Bahrain, hitting air bases in Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Kuwait's been hit really hard as well. And they're incrementally moving further and further towards Israel. So, the attacks against Jordan, including the ones that killed some US service members, that was a representation of the advancement of the Iranian sort of lawn mowing or, deforestation of this NEAD system, to use that metaphor. They are getting closer to Israel in effect, because if you're going to fire directly at Israel across all these countries, which are basically allied to Israel, they're going to shoot down those missiles if their own defenses, anti-missile defenses and radars are intact. So that's effectively what they're doing. It's not a secret per se, although the US government didn't seem to be aware of it, and the Gulf Arab states didn't seem to be very apprised of it, but the Iranians have been talking about this for a long time. And this is also a very important aspect of this whole war, that the US got into the war very casually. And from what we know from public reporting, it was because Netanyahu convinced Trump, and Trump was feeling good after Venezuela. It was a very ad hoc decision. Whereas for the Iranians, they've been preparing for this for 4 decades. They really thought about this, took it very seriously. They wanted to avoid the war, of course, and they tried to with negotiations because it entailed tremendous suffering for Iranians, despite how they're responding to it. But they have a strategy for how to deal with this, and they're currently implementing it. And when I was talking to Ryan, I used an example from boxing, which I do think is quite relevant to the situation. Muhammad Ali used to do a strategy called the rope-a-dope, and Muhammad Ali, if people remember, he wasn't really a huge boxer. He was kind of a lighter guy, and he'd fight these very big heavyweights. And his strategy was that the first few rounds he's going to get clobbered, and you just have to survive those first few rounds of the fight, and then your larger, bulkier opponent will begin to get fatigued, and their stamina will depreciate, and so forth. And then only in the 12th round or 13th round, then Muhammad Ali would start fighting really hard and then deploying all his advantages, and that's how he beat George Foreman and so forth. The Iranians are kind of doing something very analogous to that. They were clobbered in the first, I would say, 3 weeks of March. They were hit really, really hard. But after that, didn't deliver a knockout. You could see from American analysts and also from the smarter Israeli analysts also, they knew this was a big problem, because if the Iranians are not knocked out and their missiles are still in place, they're going to start retaliating very, very harshly. And the economic impacts on the global economy from the Strait of Hormuz will also start accumulating over time. So now we're in maybe the 8th round or something at this point. It's hard to say when the war will really end, but you can see that these attacks are indicative of the balance of power shifting more to the Iranian side, and their strategy of attrition, while entailing tremendous suffering within Iran, is still working effectively strategically in getting rid of this network of bases and radars and missile systems that the U.S. spent many, many years building around the region for the ultimate purpose of defending Israel.
So that part is so fascinating to me, because how the hell did the United States persuade these GCC countries, Arab countries, to host this, missile defense system, not for themselves, but for Israel? Like, how did that happen?
Well, in theory, it's for them too. Like, the idea is that we're all helping each other, and you're going to work together with the IDF and the U.S. military, CENTCOM, and CENTCOM to coordinate all these countries, and they're like partners. But if you look at the map, it does not stand up to basic logic and reasoning, because if you're Israel, you're benefiting from this a hell of a lot more than Bahrain is, or Saudi Arabia is, or Kuwait are, because they are literally right. If you take the forest analogy, they're on the outskirts of the forest, so they're getting hit really hard. Even if the system's working, they're getting hit really hard. So, the idea that these countries would emerge unscathed from a war against a much larger country that has thousands and thousands of short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, it just doesn't make sense on its face. If you look at the political economy of these countries, they're not democracies. They're not countries where people's opinion at the popular level is represented in government necessarily. They're monarchies, and they're effectively, a lot of them were tribes that the British had rounded up at one point during the British period in the Middle East and given flags and turned into countries, but they never actually been countries before. But these tribes and these ruling families, they have a lot invested in the current situation, because if there was a democratic system, their advantages were not survive that most likely, and they really have always been dependent in the beginning of their power from some outside power, whether it was the British or the US and so forth. So they feel like they can't really say no to the US. And even if this idea, which in my opinion is manifestly crazy from their perspective and their interest, if it doesn't make a lot of sense, the idea of saying no to CENTCOM, saying no to the US president, and bucking them in this way, maybe something which is not they can even comprehend doing. That's my analysis, and that's how I read it, because from their own interest standpoint, it's clearly illogical. And I will say, I mentioned this to Ryan as well, but there was an interesting interview with Abbas Araghchi, who's the Iranian foreign minister, with an Iranian channel this week. And he was talking about some conversations he had with Gulf Arab leaders before the war. And apparently these leaders told him, or it was conveyed to him in some fashion, that the Americans had said that they told the GCC countries that we're going to take like a month to solve this Iran problem. And maybe it'll be a rough month, but then you'll never have to hear about it again. It'll just be gone and we'll deal with it. And the level of faith that these countries have in American power was such that I guess that they agreed to that. And at Dropside, we did some reporting on February 20th about some of the preparations and communications that had been given to a couple of regional countries about the war. But we're many, many months into the war. Iran has not disappeared. The problem is not solved, quote unquote. And if anything, it's hitting them really even harder. It's doing a lot more damage. So the decision to trust the U.S. or embark upon this path has not paid dividends to them. And now, regardless what happens, I would say that they're in a very, very dire situation going forward, where they either will suffer, potentially catastrophic damage to their societies and economies and militaries, or they would have to accede to a new balance of power in the Persian Gulf, where Iran is much more influential and has more say over their own affairs.
Which possibility do you think is more likely to come to fruition?
Well, personally, to go back to that boxing analogy, I don't mean to belabor it, but it's hard to see how the U.S. can hit Iran harder than it hit them in the first 96 hours of the war, or even the first 3 weeks of the war. They've spent many, many years planning out how to hit Iran as hard as possible, getting all their assets in place for that initial shock and awe burst. So, even if they escalate the campaign, which seems like their indications they're going to do, they're not gonna fold from an attack which is 15% or even 30% the strength of that initial attack. They already hit them with the best shot and it didn't work. They recouped themselves and they head back and they're still in it. So they're not going to capitulate in that sense. So, I think that the most likely outcome is that Trump will exit the war. He's going to try to find some sort of face-saving way to do that. Maybe he'll launch a bombing raid against this facility he started talking about recently, Pickaxe Mountain, bomb some of the entrances to it because it's not really capable of being bombed and destroyed from the air. Conventionally, it's very deeply buried underground. It's a nuclear enrichment site. Maybe something like that. But I don't think that he has a formula here to turn it around. And some people say, well, that's unacceptable. We have to do everything we can to avoid it. Maybe you would have to invade parts of Iran, invade islands, invade coast of Iran, and so forth. I think there's two big problems with that. First of all, the US is very casualty averse in this situation, especially because the war is extremely unpopular among Americans. It's by polling data, the most unpopular war since polling started in the United States. It's more unpopular than Vietnam was many, many years into the Vietnam War. So people are not very tolerant of dozens of casualties happening on some island in Iran, or hundreds of people dying on the coast of Iran for some cause that they really just have nothing to do with the ordinary lives or concerns of Americans. That'll be tremendously costly politically. But secondly, if you actually look at a map of Iran and you look at American military capacities right now, I don't think that even if there was a draft, it would be successful in the war, bringing Iran to heel, per se. Iran is a country which is about 92 million people. It's the size of Western Europe. It has huge mountain ranges, very, very forbidding terrain for any outside military force. And if you were to invade coastal Iran, you would just create more vulnerabilities for yourself in the sense that people from central Iran would be firing drones and missiles at you. You'd have to invade deeper in the country. You'd have to effectively invade the capital and depose the government by force on the ground, and then try to stand up a new government which agrees to a new situation in the Strait of Hormuz. At that point, who knows how many Americans could be dead? And I think that the war wouldn't even work out. I think they may even in that case fail to topple the government in such an event. And by that time, Americans will not tolerate any of this at all. So I think that he inevitably has to leave. It's just that how is he going to leave and how much damage will he do before he does, both to Iranians and to people in the United States and people in the region? That's the real question, because I don't see a formula right now by which he can turn it around very easily.
I'm worried that he's just going to remain involved in this as long as possible. And there's already been a lot of damage. And, one of the things I think about a lot is a lot of oil and gas infrastructure has been destroyed. Desalination plants have been destroyed. There have been impacts on the global economy that are not easy or quick to reverse. And so the unpopularity of this war is only going to become even less popular moving forward, because more and more people, not just in America, but across the globe, are going to feel it, in their pocketbooks. They're going to feel it at the gas pump. And everyone in the global community, including most Americans, know that this war was waged not on behalf of the United States, not due to the fact that we fear for our national security, but on behalf of Israel. And so the ire that's being directed at Israel, I like to say this, I'm going to repeat it again, has absolutely nothing to do with Judaism or Jewish people. It has everything to do with Israel's conduct on the international stage and what they have, gotten themselves in the United States into in the Middle East. But let's talk a little bit about what this all means, what Iran's strategy means for Israel, because just a few days ago, you had Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich basically boasting about the fact that this, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have his exact words in front of me, but he was essentially saying, yeah, we're not going to rejoin the war. Like, we've got the Americans where we've got them, well, where we want them. Like, let them deal with it. Let them fight our war. We don't have to take the strikes. We don't have to worry about getting harmed through any of this. But based on your assessment and the Iranian strategy here, I think he's being a little too cocky, right? Because you do away with US military bases, the, missile interception, system that, by the way, US taxpayers, I'm sure, spent a lot of money on, but they've now been effectively targeted and destroyed in most cases. You do away with all that US military capability in the region. Doesn't that make Israel like a sitting duck once Iran's through with the GCC countries, once they're done hitting bases in Jordan, for instance?
Well, that should be the concern among Israeli defense planners. And I will reiterate, there are people in Israel who are aware of how bad an idea this war would have been. But those people who are probably the more professional security experts seem to be marginalized by the current government, which is dominated by these very ideological extremists who don't really know much about the rest of the region, don't know much about Iran, have this bloodthirsty sort of violence solves everything approach to things. And they also have this belief, which is being proven to be misbegotten, that American military power is unlimited. America is a great military power, of course, but it's not unlimited. There are finite stores of munitions. There's finite airframes for aircraft to conduct missions. There's finite, defense mechanisms, interceptors, and so forth. These things will run out, and also there's finite political capacity to fight an endless war in the Middle East against a very large country. So, Smotrich is very arrogant. He believes, and it's amazing he even said this, that Israeli officials are becoming much more blunt and frank about the way they view the United States, the way they view people in the region, the way they view the Palestinians, and so forth. So he's basically saying that we're playing with house money over here, and the U.S. is doing stuff for us, and we don't need to be involved in this. Even though they got the U.S. into the war, Israeli leaders are responsible for the deaths, not just of civilians in Iran, but these U.S. service members who have been killed in the war. This is because Netanyahu lobbied Trump successfully to start the conflict. So, I think that it would create a tremendous problem for them. But I think that they also have a view that the destruction of the Gulf Arab states and the destruction of parts of Jordan and so forth is not necessarily something that they are averse to, because it leaves them to be one of the last remaining powers standing in the Middle East. They could be a whole zone of destruction between themselves and Iran. And from a certain way of looking at it, their relative powers increase. So it's not that they maybe want the UAE or Saudi Arabia to be bombed, things like that, but it doesn't really affect them that much. They can survive that, and it could even be good in some other ways of looking at it. But what I would say is that, from an Israeli perspective, it is kind of alarming, to be honest, because if that MEAD system is completely dismantled around the region, which seems to be on the course to happening, Iran could fire ballistic missiles directly to Israel, and Israel would have far less warning from alarm systems to tell people to get to shelters and so forth, and also less ability to shoot down the missiles because it won't be tracking them all the way across the region. They'll be showing up on their border, with very limited warning. It's much harder to intercept them that way. And, Israel, if you look at a map, it's a pretty small country. But if you actually look at a population density map and an infrastructure map, it's a tiny country. That even that map of Israel a lot of that is desert. It's not inhabited. So there's just a few small population centers. Now, in a way, that's helpful for missile defense because you can cluster your missile defenses around those few small targets and it's a more dense web of protection. But on the other hand, if the defenses are ineffective now, or they're drained, or they're destroyed, then you have a very small pocket of population centers infrastructure, which can be hit very, very hard by ballistic missiles, by foreign power. So it could be catastrophic for Israel if this MED system collapses and their own missile defenses collapse. And we've reported drop site from US sources that their interceptors are running very, very low in Israel. So my fear, though, is that if that does happen, and it might, and Iranians start raining ballistic missiles on Israel and they start getting hit really, really hard, they may use nuclear weapons in retaliation.
Yeah.
They may hit Iran with nuclear weapons. They're the only nuclear power in the Middle East, and they have that apocalyptic mindset as well. You see it in the statements of public officials there, this Masada complex type view of things, where they may view as existential, and they may decide to use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on some part of Iran, or even strategic nuclear weapons against an Iranian city. I wouldn't count that out of the situation entirely. I hope it doesn't get to that, and I hope that something else, an off-ramp, comes on that lets everybody, de-escalate from the conflict. But one cannot rule that out, especially if the defenses around Israel truly start to collapse and the impacts on them from the missiles seem to start happening without any diplomatic or other way of diffusing it.
This is going to be a dumb question, but it's a genuine question because I don't know. But I am curious if Iran would have the capability, the capacity to destroy Israel's nuclear capability. Because I know for a fact that the Iranians aren't stupid. They know that is a threat. They know about Israel's clandestine nuclear program. So is there a way to dismantle it, destroy it without causing a mass casualty event? Because I think that would be an important thing to do when it comes to Israel. It's an unhinged country that has threatened to use their nukes while not even acknowledging that they have nukes in the first place on multiple occasions, including against the United States in the case of Jonathan Pollard. So do you know if there's a possibility, like a military solution to that?
Well, because Israel doesn't actually acknowledge it's a nuclear power, there's a lot we don't know publicly, at least, about Israel's nuclear program. And there's been a push in the United States government, was very interesting in the past year, to force more disclosure about what the US knows about Israeli nuclear weapons. And the fact that some members of Congress are pushing for that, which has never really happened before, was very interesting to me because it suggests some concern about that, some alarm based on current events or forecasted events that these Israeli nuclear weapons may be deployed, or maybe there's some urgent reason we need to have a public disclosure about this. So, with the caveat that some of the stuff is not known, it is believed that Israel enjoys a second strike nuclear capability. What that means is if their nuclear bases on the territory of Israel are neutralized by some sort of attack, if they're destroyed, Israel would still have the ability to launch nuclear weapons from a third site. That usually is believed to mean nuclear submarines, having submarines in the Mediterranean or the Red Sea that they could then fire nuclear missiles from, even if all of Israel was destroyed in an Iranian attack or a nuclear attack by some other country. So second strike nuclear capability is considered to be the gold standard of nuclear deterrence. They are believed to have that. We don't really exactly know if they do because, as I mentioned, they don't actually acknowledge it. But I think one would have to be cautious and conservative and assume that they did invest in that capacity. I don't think that the Iranians are aiming to engineer a situation that ends in a nuclear exchange. But the Iranian system is not a monolith. And I do think that they are aware that Israel is a nuclear power, it's a nuclear threat to them. And if the war did come to that point, they may consider doing a nuclear weapons test on their own to signal to Israel that if you were to use nuclear weapons against us, we would retaliate and use nuclear weapons against you. So even if we're hitting you with ballistic missiles, your response should still be conventional with regards to us, because then we could level the playing field that way and create a situation of mutually assured destruction that two nuclear powers can have. And this brings me to a second point, which haven't really, even Trump has stopped talking about this entirely, even though ostensibly that's why the war started. Iran's nuclear program, it's not really destroyed by the war, to be honest with you. Like they've been building this program for many, many decades. They hit these enrichment sites. They hit a lot of other targets. They assassinated some scientists. The nuclear program is, decades old, has many thousands of people who are involved in it, maybe even more than that. Iran trains hundreds of thousands of engineers every single year. It's a very, very large, diffuse program. If you wanted to make a nuclear weapon, you don't need these huge enrichment sites that people can see from space and drop these, bunker buster bombs and so forth on. The sites that the U.S. destroyed, these were really sites for a civilian nuclear program, because you need these huge sites if you're making nuclear fuel for a power plant. But if you want to make nuclear fuel for a nuclear weapon, you can do it in, a building the size of a suburban grocery store. That should be more than enough to enrich uranium up to 90% needed for a nuclear missile. So, I would assume that there's still, an active program. They haven't made a decision to weaponize it, as far as everyone knows, and even the conclusion of U.S. intelligence was that they had not made that decision. But, if the war is still going on and there's no detente with the U.S., there's no sanctions relief and so forth, you've got to push them in a corner where the only way to survive is to develop a nuclear deterrent of some sort. So I do think that it's very, very likely, or increasingly likely, that sometime in the next few years, anytime now, until the next few years, they may decide to cross the nuclear threshold to stop the attacks on them and to prevent an Israeli or American nuclear attack against them in the context of otherwise conventional war.
Well, I hope so. I know people think that's controversial, but I see nuclear weapons as a deterrent at this point. And if we're going to allow a country like Israel to have a clandestine nuclear program while also threatening to use those nukes, I think it's ridiculous to go to war against a country like Iran if they are seeking to develop a nuclear, weapon as a deterrent. And other countries in the region, by the way, have expressed interest in that deterrent. And it's not lost on me that Saudi Arabia happens to be one of those countries. And Trump just agreed to a nuclear deal with them today. It was announced today. So we'll see how that all plays out. But ultimately, final thing I'll say about this, it does appear that all of those national security threats that Israel's been fear-mongering about and claiming will ultimately destroy Israel if we don't do something about it right away wasn't really the national security threat. It looks like Israel is its own national security threat. I mean, was there any indication that Iran was looking to invade Israel, take over Israel? If Israel stopped attempting to expand its borders and annex land in countries like Syria, Lebanon, obviously take over Gaza and the West Bank, is there any indication that Iran or its proxy groups would, just randomly go after Israel? Like, I don't think Israel was ever really unsafe. What made them unsafe was attempting to take land that doesn't belong to them. That's my read of it. But, I'm open to a challenge on that.
Well, in 2015, the Iranians, the government was ruled by the reformist wing of the country, and they signed this nuclear deal with the U.S. In the vision that gradually over time there'd be a normalization of Iranian relations with the U.S. and U.S. partners in the region. And maybe not everyone will not all be friends and kiss and make up, but there would at least be some sort of pragmatic arrangement and understanding, and the conflicts and so forth could be attenuated and gradually brought to an end. What happened was that the one person who was most against this was Benjamin Netanyahu, and with the first Trump term, he basically got his hooks into Trump. He pumped him up with the stuff about Obama and the nuclear deal, and Trump eventually revoked the nuclear deal in 2018. He started this campaign of assassinations and attacks and sanctions against Iran, because the Israeli preference was not to, from their view, roll the dice on normalization of Iran in the region. The best thing to do is destroy Iran, and you can't do that because you're too small, so get the US to destroy Iran. Better, safe, their view of strategy at this point, you can kind of perceive it as, it's better if everybody's dead. Everybody's dead and destroyed, then we can be absolutely 100% safe. Create the piece of the graveyard, you could say. So that's what they've been treating Iran. They've kind of blown up every off-ramp. And before this war, and before even the last war last year, the Iranians, and it's been documented, especially in February of this year, they made very, very far-reaching offers for normalization of the nuclear program and so forth. They really offered Trump things well beyond anything that Obama got in the 2015 deal. He could have taken that and run with it, but at what we now know is the urging of Netanyahu and people like Jared Kushner and Wickoff and so forth in the administration, instead blew up the negotiations, attacked the negotiators, killed people in the middle of negotiations, and pushed forward with this war because they wanted to force Iran into a position of submission or destruction, rather than try to take the olive branch of making a deal and trying to move forward to a pragmatic arrangement. So that's really the issue. They've been using brute force in every circumstance. But the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, this force is not unlimited, it's not omnipotent, and it's pissing a lot of people off in the United States because, even in the defense establishment, a lot of people were against this war because their view was we need to devote our resources to Asia, or we need to devote to the Western Hemisphere, or we need to reinvest in the domestic population and things like this. The last thing people wanted was another forever war in the Middle East, and not just another forever war, the mother of all forever wars, the one with the biggest country in the region. But that's what they got, and that's what the Israelis pretty much pushed the US into. So it is really outrageous. I think as American taxpayers and citizens, people should be utterly enraged by this. And now that people, many Iranians have been killed, including civilians, but now that US service members are also dying needlessly, 19-year-olds and 23-year-olds in these missile attacks for a completely pointless war for a foreign country, it's just outrageous. So I do think that eventually there would be some political blowback from this domestically, but at the same time, the Israelis are aware of this. They're aware of the collapsing popularity of their country in the United States. So they're trying to just simply embed themselves in the defense industrial base of the United States, hide their relationship a bit more effectively, and even grow in that way. And that's why this NDAA was passed today, which basically merges the two militaries in some ways. So on the defense technology way. So I think that's their preemptive way of avoiding blowback from this war and many other things of the last couple of years.
I think you're right about that. Hopefully the Senate squashes that provision, merging our militaries. But if that does pass, deep state gets even deeper, and that's a big problem here in the United States. Anyway, Murtaza, an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your insights, and I hope you come back soon.
Thanks, Elena.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.